starts with a single question. What really happened that night? A quiet evening shattered. A normal day ending in whispers of the unexplainable. Decades later, the story is still alive, haunting us with more questions than answers. Eyewitnesses claim one thing, officials declare another. The truth slipped through our fingers like smoke. Every generation has that story, the one neighbors still lower their voices to discuss, the one the media picked apart but never solved, the one that leaves us staring into the dark a little longer than we'd like. Was it a tragic accident, or something more sinister? Was it human error, or something beyond our understanding? What unfolded that night became more than an event. It became a legend, a chilling reminder of how fragile truth can be when tangled with fear, cover-ups, and mystery. And tonight, we're diving into the shadows to retrace every step of that unforgettable night. Chapter 1. The night that changed everything. It was an ordinary evening, or at least that's how it began. The streets were quiet, the rhythm of life unshaken, and no one could have guessed that within hours, whispers of what happened would ripple through the world. That night, normality fractured. Some who were there recall an eerie stillness in the air, as if the night itself was holding its breath. Others remember sudden chaos. Voices raised, movements blurred, a sense that something unnatural had slipped into their reality. Whatever the details, every witness agrees on one thing. It was a night unlike any other. In the days that followed, stories clashed like jagged pieces of a broken mirror. Officials rushed to offer explanations, yet none seemed to fit cleanly. Survivors stumbled through their accounts, haunted by details that refused to align. And the rest of us? We've been left with fragments, shadows, and questions that still echo decades later. What really happened that night remains tangled in speculation and silence. But one thing is certain. From that moment on, life for those involved would never be the same. And neither would the way the world looked at the mystery that unfolded. Because sometimes, history doesn't just record events. Sometimes it records enigmas. Chapter 2 First Reports. The chaos begins. News rarely arrives fully formed. Comes in fragments. A phone call here, a frantic voice on the radio there. And on that night, the first reports were anything but clear. Some people swore they heard shouting in the distance, while others insisted they saw strange lights or unusual movements. Within hours, rumors spread faster than the truth could ever catch up. Local authorities scrambled to piece together what was happening, but confusion reigned. Was it an accident? A crime? Something beyond either? Nobody could say for sure. The earliest journalists on the scene painted wildly different pictures. One headline declared a tragedy, another hinted at conspiracy, and yet another dismissed it all as hysteria. And as each version gained traction, the real story became harder to find, buried under a flood of speculation. For the people living through it, those first hours were chaotic, terrifying, and unforgettable. Phone lines buzzed with urgent conversations, neighbors gathered in the streets, and whispers turned into full-blown theories before anyone truly understood what had occurred. It's often said that the first version of history is written in confusion, and here that chaos shaped the narrative we still wrestle with today. The truth may have been simple, but in those early hours it felt anything but. Chapter 3 The People Involved. Behind every mystery are the people who lived it. The names, the faces, the voices that echo long after the headlines fade. And on that night, a cast of ordinary men and women found themselves swept into something extraordinary. There were the witnesses, neighbors, travelers, and bystanders who happened to be in the wrong place at the right time. Some described the events in vivid detail, while others stumbled over fragments, their memories broken by fear. A few remained steadfast in their accounts, refusing to change their stories no matter the pressure. Then there were the victims, those whose lives were altered forever. Some vanished without explanation, others carried scars, both visible and hidden. Their families became central figures in the search for truth, torn between grief and the desperate need for answers. And, of course, the officials, investigators, law enforcement, and experts brought in to contain the situation. Some tried earnestly to bring clarity, while others seemed to cloud it further, intentionally or not. Each of these players left behind a thread, and together those threads form the tangled web we're still trying to unravel. Without them, there would be no story. With them, we get glimpses of truth, but also more contradictions. Because sometimes, the mystery isn't just about what happened. It's about who was there to see it. Chapter 4: A Timeline in Fragments. If only we had a neat minute-by-minute record of that night. But what survives is more like a shattered clock. Fragments of time, scattered accounts, and gaps that leave us wondering what slipped through the cracks. Some say it all began just after dusk, when the first signs of trouble flickered across the horizon. Others insist it started later, deep into the night, when most people were already asleep. The timeline bends depending on who you ask. One group of witnesses recalls hearing a sharp noise, a crash, an explosion, a scream around 9 p.m. Yet official reports place the first emergency calls closer to 10:30. That 90-minute discrepancy has fueled endless speculation. What happened in between? As the hours unfolded, the story only grew murkier. People claimed they saw officials arrive long before authorities admitted to being on scene. Neighbors described unusual activity in the area days prior, suggesting that whatever happened wasn't sudden at all, but part of something planned. By dawn, the narrative had already split in too many directions. For every timestamp pinned down, another was questioned. The night refused to align into a single, clear sequence, leaving investigators and all of us to sort through a puzzle missing half its pieces. And maybe that's exactly how someone wanted it. Chapter 5: The Official Story. Every mystery eventually meets an explanation, or at least the attempt at one. And in the days that followed, officials stepped forward to give theirs. Press conferences were held. Calm voices reassured the public that there was nothing unusual, nothing to fear. The narrative was clean, simple, and carefully packaged. What happened was tragic, yes, but entirely explainable. A straightforward chain of events, nothing more. But here's where the cracks begin to show. The official story often contradicted itself. Times didn't match up with eyewitness reports. Statements made one day were revised the next. Details were omitted, altered, or left suspiciously vague. Authorities pointed to natural causes, an accident, a miscommunication, or a technical failure. On paper, it sounded convincing, but for those who had seen or heard otherwise, it felt hollow, even dismissive. Some locals whispered that the officials seemed more interested in shutting down questions than finding real answers. And once a narrative is set by those in power, it tends to stick. Newspapers echoed it, broadcasts repeated it, and soon it became the version most of the world accepted. Yet beneath that polished story, doubts continued to simmer. Because when an explanation fits too neatly, you can't help but wonder, what's hiding between the lines? Chapter 6: Conflicting Witnesses. If the official story was neat and tidy, the eyewitness accounts were anything but. In fact, they were messy, emotional, and often impossible to reconcile. One man swore he saw strange lights streaking across the sky that night. Lights that didn't behave like planes, flares, or anything familiar. Another claimed he heard not one, but two separate incidents, spaced hours apart. A woman living nearby remembered seeing officials arrive before anything had even happened, while a passerby insisted he saw them scrambling to catch up long after. These contradictions weren't small. They tore the timeline apart, raising questions that officials struggled to answer. And when eyewitnesses were pressed, some doubled down, their voices shaking with certainty. Others changed their stories under pressure, creating even more confusion. Were these people misremembering in the heat of fear? Or were their testimonies deliberately discredited to maintain a controlled narrative? That question has haunted the case for decades. What makes this even stranger is how consistent some fringe details were. Multiple witnesses, who never knew each other, reported the same odd sounds, the same eerie silences, the same impossible flashes of light. Coincidence? Maybe, but maybe not. In the end, the witnesses didn't just conflict with the official story, they conflicted with each other. And sometimes that only deepens the mystery. Chapter 7: The Evidence That Vanished. In every great mystery, there comes a moment when the trail goes cold. Not because there are no clues, but because the clues disappear. That's exactly what happened here. Key documents were reported, logged, and then quietly went missing. Photographs that supposedly captured the scene never resurfaced. Some physical items, initially collected as evidence, were later declared lost in storage or misfiled. The pattern became impossible to ignore. One investigator later admitted that boxes of reports were suddenly reassigned to a different department, never to be seen again. Another spoke of recordings, audio tapes of frantic phone calls that night, that were inexplicably erased. Even maps and sketches drawn in the first days were said to have degraded or been discarded. It's one thing for evidence to be incomplete. It's another for it to vanish in ways that always seem to benefit the official version of events. Was it incompetence, bureaucratic chaos, or a deliberate effort to erase inconvenient details? For the families, it felt like betrayal. For researchers, it was infuriating. And for conspiracy theorists, it was proof, the smoking gun not in what was found, but in what was taken away. Because sometimes, the silence of missing evidence speaks louder than any document ever could. Chapter 8: Media Frenzy. If confusion ruled the night, the morning belonged to the media. Within hours, headlines screamed across newspapers, radios buzzed with speculation, and television anchors leaned into the drama. What had started as a local incident suddenly became a national obsession. The coverage wasn't uniform. Some outlets clung tightly to the official narrative, presenting it as fact with no room for doubt. Others ran sensational stories filled with dramatic language, fanning the flames of rumor. And a few dared to publish the testimonies that didn't fit neatly anywhere. The strange, unsettling details that kept readers awake at night. The result? A frenzy. People crowded newsstands for updates, tuned into late-night broadcasts, and swapped theories over kitchen tables. Every version of the story seemed to contradict the last, leaving the public unsure who or what to believe. But media attention cuts both ways. It can shine a spotlight on hidden truths, or it can drown them in noise. Some argued that the press gave oxygen to wild theories, distracting from the facts. Others believed the media was complicit, pushing a sanitized narrative and ignoring the voices that didn't fit the mold. What's clear is this: the story had escaped containment. It was no longer just about what happened that night. It was about who controlled the story of what happened. Chapter 9: Theories Take Shape. When facts are scarce and evidence slips through fingers, theories rush in to fill the void. And in the weeks after that night, speculation multiplied like wildfire. Some people clung to the simplest explanation: a tragic accident. Maybe machinery failed, maybe someone made a mistake, maybe it was all human error wrapped in bad timing. Clean, rational, and easy to accept. But others weren't so quick to settle. Witnesses who swore they saw lights insisted something airborne was involved, an aircraft no one could officially account for. Rumors spread of secret military tests gone wrong, hushed experiments that spilled over into public view. Then came the stranger ideas. Whispers of cover-ups stretched into theories of hidden technology, or even forces beyond our understanding. The more authorities denied, the more people leaned into suspicion. Over time, these theories split into camps. The skeptics who trusted the official word, the cautious who sensed there was more beneath the surface, and the fringe believers who saw the event as proof of something extraordinary. The truth, of course, was still buried. But the sheer number of competing explanations made one thing clear: whatever happened that night was no ordinary event. It had become a canvas onto which everyone painted their own version of reality. Chapter 10: Strange Behavior. Sometimes the biggest clues aren't found in evidence or reports, but in the way people act afterward. And in the wake of that night, several individuals behaved in ways that raised eyebrows and suspicions. Officials who were usually composed seemed nervous, even evasive, when pressed for details. One spokesperson abruptly canceled a press briefing mid-sentence, refusing to answer questions that went off script. Another gave conflicting statements within days, as if the story was being rewritten on the fly. Even among locals, there were odd reactions. A handful of witnesses who initially spoke freely suddenly went silent. Some avoided reporters altogether, while others retracted their accounts without explanation. Families close to the victims reported unusual visits, officials knocking at their doors late at night, urging them not to spread rumors. Then there were the strange disappearances. A journalist investigating the case claimed her notes had been stolen from her apartment. Another researcher reported being followed, shadowed by unmarked cars after publishing an article that questioned the official narrative. Individually, these behaviors might be dismissed as coincidence or paranoia, but together, they created an atmosphere of unease, as though someone, somewhere, was working hard to keep certain details buried. Because in mysteries like this, actions can speak louder than words. And these actions whispered of secrets no one wanted uncovered. Chapter 11: Secrets Behind Closed Doors. While the public wrestled with confusion, something else was happening in private. Hushed meetings, restricted documents, and conversations never meant to see daylight. Insiders later hinted that, in the days following the incident, high-level officials gathered behind locked doors. The agenda? Not justice, not answers, but containment. What was said in those rooms never reached the public, but leaks suggested the tone was urgent, even fearful. Classified memos that surfaced years later painted a curious picture. Discussions of public perception, narrative control, and minimizing exposure overshadowed any talk of truth. In one document, a line stood out like a warning. Certain details must remain undisclosed in the interest of stability. Even stranger were reports of outside agencies suddenly taking an interest. Experts with no clear jurisdiction appeared, conducted their own inquiries, and then disappeared just as quickly. Locals swore they saw unusual vehicles and personnel near the site, though no records confirm it. For those on the outside, it felt like a play unfolding on two stages. The public was given a neat explanation. Behind closed doors, something far less tidy was being managed. And once secrets are sealed in shadows, they grow. They gain power. They become the foundation of the conspiracy theories that still thrive today. Because what we don't know is often more dangerous than what we do. Chapter 12: Patterns in History. Strange as it may sound, this wasn't the first time a night like this left behind more questions than answers. In fact, when you step back, the incident begins to echo through history. Think of other mysterious events. Sudden disappearances, unexplained crashes, disasters wrapped in secrecy. Each carries familiar fingerprints, confused witnesses, vanishing evidence, official stories that don't quite add up. The details differ, but the pattern? Strikingly similar. Take earlier cases where entire communities swore they saw things that authorities denied. Or moments when governments rushed to issue polished statements before all the facts were even known. Over and over, the script feels recycled. Chaos, control, silence. Some historians argue this repetition is no accident. They suggest these patterns point to a long-standing practice, a playbook for handling events that threaten public order or reveal things not meant to be revealed. Others push back, saying humans are simply prone to see connections where none exist. But when survivors of this night hear stories from decades before or even after, they can't help but feel a chill, because their experience, unique and haunting to them, suddenly fits into a larger chain. And if history repeats itself, then maybe this mystery isn't an isolated event at all, but part of something much bigger. Chapter 13: The Survivor's Perspective. For all the theories, documents, and speculation, nothing cuts deeper than hearing from the people who were actually there. Survivors carried the weight of that night in ways outsiders could never fully grasp. Some spoke openly, describing in painful detail the sights and sounds that refused to fade. They remembered the chaos, the fear, the feeling that reality itself had twisted. Their words often cracked under the pressure of memory, as though reliving it still cost them something. Others stayed silent for years. Trauma does that, it buries itself deep, surfacing only in fragments. For a few, it wasn't until decades later that they shared their stories, sometimes in interviews, sometimes in private letters discovered by family members. The survivors often agreed on one thing: what happened changed them forever. Nightmares lingered. Trust in institutions eroded. Communities fractured as neighbors argued over what was true and what was imagined. Even those who tried to move on found the past creeping back, haunting them in small ways. Listening to them, you realize this wasn't just a mystery, it was a wound. And while researchers chase theories, survivors carry scars. Their accounts remind us that behind every enigma are human beings, forever tethered to a night that refuses to let them go. Chapter 14: Science Weighs In. When eyewitness accounts clash and rumors run wild, people often turn to science for clarity. Experts were brought in: physicists, engineers, psychologists, each hoping to peel away the layers of confusion surrounding that night. Some approached it methodically, analyzing timelines, environmental data, and physical traces from the scene. They pointed to natural explanations, weather anomalies, technical malfunctions, or the tricks of human perception under stress. On paper, their findings sounded plausible. But the deeper they dug, the more inconsistencies emerged. Certain noises reported by dozens of witnesses couldn't be explained by weather or machinery. Light patterns described by locals didn't match known aircraft or atmospheric events. And then there were the psychological studies. Experts claimed stress and fear could distort memory, yet some testimonies were eerily consistent across people who had never met. Science, for all its rigor, struggled to fit the pieces together. Every rational theory left gaps, unanswered questions that refused to go away. And the more the experts tried to simplify the story, the more it seemed to resist simplification. For skeptics, these analyses were enough to dismiss the extraordinary. But for believers, the failure of science to provide a complete answer only strengthened the sense that something unusual had occurred. Because sometimes the data doesn't close the case, it only makes the mystery deeper. Chapter 15: The Unexplainable. Every case has its puzzles, but this one carried elements that simply refused to bend to reason. Details so strange, so out of place, that even hardened investigators hesitated to put them on record. Take the sounds, for example. Multiple witnesses described a low, vibrating hum that shook windows but registered on no instruments. Others reported sudden silences, moments when the usual night noises of insects, dogs, even the wind, seemed to vanish all at once, nature itself pausing. Then there were the lights, not just one or two but several, darting in ways no known aircraft could mimic. Sharp turns, sudden stops, vanishing and reappearing in different parts of the sky. Officials explained them as flares, yet seasoned locals who'd seen countless flares swore these were different. Even the physical traces resisted explanation. Burn marks appeared on the ground where nothing had burned. Metallic fragments were briefly catalogued, then disappeared without analysis. And in some cases, watches and radios reportedly stopped working during the incident, only to resume later. Separately, these details might be written off as mistakes or exaggerations. But together, they create a portrait of something outside the ordinary. Something that refuses to be neatly folded into the boxes of science, psychology, or simple coincidence. And that's the heart of the mystery, the pieces that no explanation can hold. Chapter 16: Cover-up or Coincidence. Whenever evidence goes missing, witnesses contradict officials, and explanations feel rehearsed, two possibilities emerge. Either it's all coincidence, or it's a cover-up. Those who lean toward coincidence argue that human error explains everything. Records vanish because of poor filing systems. Witnesses remember details differently because memory under stress is unreliable. Officials stumble in their statements because they're pressured, not because they're hiding anything. From this view, the mystery is nothing more than a perfect storm of mistakes. But then there are the patterns, the missing files that always seem to be the important ones. The silenced witnesses who change their stories only after private meetings. The officials who seem more concerned with perception than truth. To many, this looks less like chance and more like deliberate control. Conspiracy theorists argue the cover-up began the very night of the incident, with carefully crafted statements designed to steer the narrative. They see secrecy not as clumsiness, but as intent. The truth may lie somewhere between the two. Maybe incompetence tangled with secrecy, creating a fog that still hasn't lifted. Or maybe one side is right, and the other dangerously wrong. What's undeniable is this: The line between coincidence and cover-up remains blurred. And in that blur, the mystery continues to breathe. Chapter 17, Pop Culture Echoes. When a story refuses to die, it seeps into culture. That's exactly what happened here. The mystery of that night stopped being just an event. It became inspiration. Movies began weaving in subtle references. A character's unexplained disappearance, a sudden flash in the sky, shadowy officials sweeping a scene. To most viewers, these were just gripping plot devices. But to those who knew the story, the parallels felt uncanny. Books, too, leaned into the legend. Some were journalistic deep dives, others full-blown thrillers, blurring the line between fact and fiction. Radio hosts dissected the incident for late-night audiences, sparking endless call-ins from people who swore they knew someone who was there. Even music wasn't immune. Lyrics slipped in cryptic nods to "The Night No One Explains." Over time, the mystery transformed from a tragedy into a cultural symbol, a shorthand for the unexplained, the covered-up, the eerie gap between truth and story. This pop culture presence kept the mystery alive for new generations. Teenagers who hadn't been born when it happened still whispered about it at sleepovers, passing the legend down like folklore. And perhaps that's the most haunting part. When fact becomes myth, the truth may fade, but the story never will. Chapter 18, The Skeptic's View. For every chilling account and whispered theory, there's another voice pushing back. The skeptics. To them, this case isn't a mystery at all. It's a story inflated by fear, media frenzy, and human imagination. They point out how unreliable memory can be, especially under stress. Witnesses, they argue, weren't lying. They were scared. Fear bends perception, turns ordinary sights into extraordinary ones. That humming sound could have been distant machinery. The strange lights, aircraft flares easily mistaken in the dark. Skeptics also highlight how stories grow in the telling. One person's odd detail becomes another's proof, and soon a rumor snowballs into a legend. By the time journalists arrive, the story has already mutated. Add in missing documents, which skeptics chalk up to sloppy record-keeping, and you have the perfect recipe for conspiracy without any real conspiracy. To them, the persistence of this mystery isn't evidence of something extraordinary, but proof of how myths work. People love a puzzle, they love secrets, and they love believing there's more to the world than meets the eye. And yet, skeptics often face a problem of their own. For every rational explanation, there are always details they can't quite sweep away. The silences, the fragments, the patterns that don't fit. Even for doubters, the mystery never fully disappears. Chapter 19, Chilling Testimonies. Long after the officials moved on and the headlines faded, some accounts surfaced that shook the story all over again. These weren't polished reports or carefully staged interviews. They were raw, unsettling testimonies, the kind that linger in your mind long after you've heard them. One came from a diary discovered years later. The writer described hearing footsteps outside their home that night, heavy, deliberate, even though no one was there when they checked. Another entry ended abruptly, mid-sentence, as if the pen had been yanked from the page. A taped interview revealed a witness who refused to go on record during the original investigation. Their voice trembled as they described seeing figures moving through the darkness. Not in panic, but with precision, as though they knew exactly what was unfolding. Even more chilling were the private letters between families. Some spoke of strange phone calls at odd hours, the line going dead after a single whispered warning, "Stop asking questions." These testimonies may not hold the weight of official documents, but their emotional truth is undeniable. They pulse with fear, confusion, and the sense of something left unresolved. And while skeptics dismiss them as exaggerations, they remind us of one thing. For the people who lived it, this was never just a story. It was a nightmare that refused to end. Chapter 20, The Silence That Followed. In the weeks after the chaos, the story was everywhere, on the front page, on television, in hushed conversations. But over time, something strange happened. The noise faded, the questions dulled, and then, silence. Families who once spoke out publicly began to withdraw. Survivors who gave interviews stopped returning calls. Even journalists, once relentless, moved on to safer ground. It was as if the whole community decided or was persuaded to stop talking. Some chalked it up to exhaustion. After all, how long can anyone live inside a mystery without breaking down? But others believed the quiet wasn't natural. They pointed to subtle pressures. Jobs suddenly lost, grants denied, reputations quietly smeared. A pattern that suggested speaking out carried consequences. Official statements also dried up. Requests for information were ignored, and records that once seemed accessible became classified or unavailable. The silence was systematic, heavy, and deliberate. And in that quiet, the mystery only deepened. Because silence doesn't erase questions, it amplifies them. The absence of answers became its own kind of evidence, a void that hinted at the weight of whatever truth remained hidden. Sometimes, silence is more deafening than the loudest alarm. And here it left a community haunted not just by what happened, but by what was never spoken again. Chapter 21: New Evidence Emerges. For years, the case seemed frozen in silence. Then, just when it looked destined to fade into obscurity, new evidence surfaced, breathing life back into the mystery. Started small. A retired official came forward with documents he claimed to have kept hidden, notes scribbled in the margins that didn't match the official reports. Soon after, a set of photographs, long thought destroyed, appeared in a private collection. Blurry and grainy, yes, but unmistakably showing details that contradicted the official narrative. Then came the testimonies. People who had stayed quiet for decades suddenly decided to speak, perhaps emboldened by time, or by the belief that they had nothing left to lose. Their accounts didn't always match each other perfectly, but they shared threads, patterns that echoed the earliest, most troubling witness statements. And in the digital age, researchers uncovered archived files that once sat buried in forgotten drawers. A single page here, a fragment there, but enough to reopen debates once considered closed. Each new piece didn't solve the puzzle. If anything, it made the picture more complicated. But for those who had waited years for fresh leads, it was proof the story wasn't finished. The past has a way of clawing its way back. And in this case, it returned with whispers too loud to ignore. Chapter 22: Theories Revisited. With new fragments of evidence on the table, researchers and enthusiasts rushed to revisit the theories that had circulated for years. Suddenly, explanations once dismissed as far-fetched didn't seem so impossible. The accident theory was re-examined under modern scrutiny. Could technical failures have caused the chaos? Some argued yes, pointing to overlooked mechanical flaws. Others countered that the new documents revealed too many inconsistencies for it to be that simple. The cover-up theory gained momentum. Fresh testimonies suggested officials knew more than they admitted, perhaps even before the night unfolded. Old suspicions about hidden experiments resurfaced, now bolstered by newly uncovered files hinting at classified operations in the area. Even the stranger theories, the ones skeptics once laughed off, found renewed attention. Researchers noted how certain details, like the unexplained lights and physical anomalies, still resisted conventional explanation. Was it experimental technology, or something even further beyond the known? The beauty and the frustration of revisiting these theories is that none of them fully explain everything. Each solves one piece of the puzzle, only to leave another piece dangling. But that's the essence of this case. No theory fits perfectly, yet every theory feels dangerously close to the truth. And so the debate reignited, sharper than ever, as the past collided with the present. Chapter 23: The Emotional Legacy. Beyond the documents, beyond the theories, lies something harder to measure: the emotional toll. Because while researchers debated causes and skeptics chased explanations, ordinary people were left to carry the weight of that night. For families, the unanswered questions became a wound that never fully healed. Some clung to official explanations, trying to find peace in certainty, even if that certainty felt shaky. Others refused to accept any version of events that didn't align with their memories. This divide sometimes tore communities apart, with neighbors quietly judging each other's beliefs. Survivors carried their own scars. For some, it was the nightmares, flashes of sound and light, or the feeling of being watched when alone. For others, it was the silence, the sense that no one really wanted to hear their truth. That loneliness, they said, was almost worse than the event itself. And then there were those who turned the pain into purpose, pushing for transparency, writing books, or sharing testimonies so the mystery wouldn't vanish into obscurity. Their persistence ensured that the story wasn't forgotten. The emotional legacy of that night isn't just about grief. It's about resilience, too. About how humans cling to memory, even when the truth stays hidden. Because at its heart, this mystery isn't just a puzzle to solve. It's a reminder of how deeply the unknown can touch our lives. Chapter 24, Where We Stand Today. So, after decades of speculation, investigation, and debate, where do we stand now? The short answer: somewhere between clarity and chaos. On one hand, technology has given us tools the original investigators could only dream of. Digitized archives, satellite imagery, forensic analysis, all help modern researchers re-examine the fragments left behind. These advances have clarified some details, ruling out certain theories once and for all. On the other hand, the deeper we dig, the stranger the picture becomes. Every new discovery seems to raise just as many questions as it answers. And so, the mystery survives, not as a relic of the past, but as an active conversation that still sparks debates online, in documentaries, and around late-night campfires. Today, the incident has become more than a story. It's a symbol, a shorthand for the unknown, the unexplained, the moments when reality feels thinner than we'd like to believe. For some, it represents government secrecy. For others, the fallibility of human memory. And for many, it remains an unsolved puzzle that keeps them up at night. The truth may never be fully uncovered. But what's undeniable is this: the mystery of that night still grips us, still provokes, still whispers through the years. And perhaps that's why it endures. Because sometimes the not knowing is more powerful than any answer. Chapter 25, The Unanswered Question. Every mystery, no matter how tangled, comes down to a single haunting question. What really happened that night? We've sifted through the reports, the testimonies, the theories, the silences. We've listened to skeptics and believers, weighed rational explanations against eerie details that refuse to fade. And yet, the answer remains just out of reach. Maybe the truth is buried in a locked archive, waiting for the day someone dares to open it. Maybe it slipped away in the chaos, lost to time forever. Or maybe, and this is the most unsettling possibility, the truth was never something we could fully understand in the first place. What we're left with is the power of the unknown. A reminder that some events don't fit neatly into boxes. That sometimes, reality doesn't give us closure. But here's the thing. Mysteries like this endure not because they're unsolvable, but because they spark something deeper in us. Wonder, fear, curiosity, the drive to keep asking, to keep searching, to keep the story alive. So what really happened that night? Perhaps we'll never know. Perhaps that's the point. The unanswered question itself has become the legacy. One that keeps echoing generation after generation, daring us to look closer into the dark.